The city feared Kong Day. Not respected, not admired, feared. He had built his empire on broken bones and whispered threats, on deals sealed in blood and promises kept through violence. His name alone cleared rooms. His shadow made grown men cross the street. For 15 years, he had been untouchable, a ghost wrapped in flesh, a nightmare with a heartbeat. But tonight, the king was on his knees. If you want the full story, every twist, every betrayal, and the moment his mother's secret finally explodes into war, hit like, comment, share, and subscribe right now. Rain hammered the pavement as Kong pressed another poster against the brick wall, his fingers trembling as he smoothed the tape across the top. The paper soaked through, his mother's face bleeding into gray smears in the downpour. He didn't care. He pulled another poster from the stack and moved to the next wall. A few steps behind him, Yong kept the stack dry under his jacket, saying nothing, watching everything. He was the kind of loyal that didn't need reassurance, only orders. Missing, Mei Lin Day, 67 years old. Last seen, wearing a green cardigan. 21 days. 3 weeks of nothing, not a voluntary disappearance. 21 days, where the world kept moving, while his mother's life had been paused somewhere he couldn't reach. 3 weeks of dead leads and cold trails, and police officers who barely pretended to search. 3 weeks of his mother's empty chair at the kitchen table, her slippers still by the door, her reading glasses on the nightstand where she'd left them. Kong's hands were the same hands that had ended men, the same hands that had signed death warrants and counted blood money and never once shook during the darkest hours of his work. Now they wouldn't stop trembling. A group of teenagers huddled under a bus shelter, watching him. He felt their eyes, heard their whispers. They recognized him. Everyone here recognized him. But none of them moved to help. None of them offered information. They just watched the monster tape, desperate pleas to crumbling walls like any other grieving son. Please, he said to no one, to everyone, to the rain and the empty streets and the city that had always bowed to his commands. Someone has to know something. Silence answered him. He pressed his forehead against the brick, water streaming down his face, and he couldn't tell anymore if it was rain or something else. His mother had never asked what he did, never questioned the money or the cars or the men who came and went at odd hours. She just made him tea every Sunday, asked if he was eating enough, and told him she was proud of him, not of his power, not of his reputation, but of him, the boy she'd raised alone, the boy who used to cry when she worked double shifts and he fell asleep without her goodnight kiss. She was the only one who still saw that boy. And now she was gone. Kong pushed off the wall and kept walking, kept posting, kept begging a city that owed him nothing and feared him too much to help. His soldiers had searched every warehouse, every gambling den, every corner of his territory. His money had bought silence instead of answers. His violence had produced corpses instead of leads. Power meant nothing when the streets went quiet. Reputation meant nothing when the only witness was the rain. He was Kong Day. He had made this city bleed. He had made it kneel. And now, for the woman who had loved him before he became a monster, he would do what kings never do. He would beg. Alana Kim had learned long ago that the city didn't care whether she lived or died. So she stopped caring, too. She worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour laundromat in the industrial district, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects, and the only customers were night workers, insomniacs, and people running from something they couldn't name. The pay was barely enough to cover her rent a cramped studio above a noodle shop that smelled permanently of garlic and regret. But it was hers. 4 walls that no one could take from her. She had aged out of the foster system at 18 with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes and a social worker's hollow wish for good luck. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of learning to sleep light, trust no one, and keep her head down. 6 years of understanding that kindness was a currency she couldn't afford. And yet, 3 weeks ago, she had been walking home after her shift, taking the shortcut through the warehouse district, because the buses didn't run that late, and her feet knew the shadows better than the streetlights. The night was cold, the kind of cold that crawled into your bones and made you walk faster. She had her hands shoved in her pockets and her hood pulled low, invisible the way she'd trained herself to be. Then she heard it. A cry, weak, almost animal. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to keep walking. But this wasn't her business. This wasn't her problem. In neighborhoods like this, strange noises meant danger, and danger meant death for girls who had no one to notice they were gone. But her feet stopped anyway. The sound came from behind a shuttered warehouse, the kind of place that hadn't seen legitimate business in years. Alana crept closer, her heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She found a gap in the chain-link fence, squeezed through, and followed the sound to a side door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the darkness smelled of rust and rot. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept it across the space. The beam landed on a cage. Inside the cage was an old woman. She was curled on the concrete floor, her thin body wrapped in filthy clothes, her white hair matted with dirt and dried blood. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. A chain connected the cage to a support beam, the lock old and rusted but still holding. Alana didn't think. She didn't calculate risk or weigh consequences. She simply moved. The lock gave way after 3 hard strikes with a pipe she found on the ground. The cage door screamed open. Alana crawled inside, lifted the woman's head, and felt for a pulse. Weak, but there. "Hey," she whispered. "Can you hear me? I'm going to get you out of here." The woman's eyes fluttered open, confused, terrified, then, slowly, trusting. Alana carried her out of that warehouse like she weighed nothing, though her arms burned and her legs shook. She wrapped the woman in her own coat, hailed the first taxi she'd ever paid for in her life, and brought her home. She didn't call the police. The police had never helped Alana with anything. She didn't ask questions. Questions led to complications, and complications led to the woman being taken somewhere Alana couldn't protect her. Instead, she cleaned the woman's wounds, fed her soup, and gave her the only bed in the apartment while she slept on the floor. Days passed. The woman couldn't remember her name, couldn't remember where she came from or who had taken her. She only knew fragments, red lights, cold hands, a door that never opened. Alana called her Halmoni, grandmother, because the woman reminded her of a dream she'd had once, a long time ago, of what family might feel like. And for 3 weeks, 2 forgotten souls built something fragile and precious in that cramped apartment above the noodle shop, something that felt almost like home. The diner was the kind of place that existed between worlds. Too grimy for the business crowd, too expensive for the homeless, it served burnt coffee to night workers and overcooked eggs to people who had nowhere else to be. Alana had stopped there on her way to her shift because the cold had settled deep in her chest, and she needed something warm before facing another 8 hours of humming machines and lonely customers. She sat at the counter, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, her eyes half closed. The television mounted in the corner played news she didn't listen to. The cook argued with someone in the kitchen. The world moved around her in a blur of noise and motion that had nothing to do with her life. Then the door opened. She didn't look up at first. People came and went. None of them mattered. But something about the silence that followed made her raise her head. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat that probably cost more than her annual rent. His face was sharp, angular, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow that suggested violence was not a stranger to him. But it wasn't his appearance that made the diner go quiet. It was his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything and was holding himself together through sheer force of will, desperate, hollow, haunted. He moved through the diner like a man underwater, approaching tables one by one, holding up a piece of paper, asking a question in a voice that cracked at the edges. No one met his gaze. No one answered. They looked away, shook their heads, suddenly fascinated by their food. Alana watched him work his way toward her end of the counter. She watched his hands shake as he smoothed the poster against the table. She watched his jaw tighten when another person turned their back. Then he was standing next to her. "Please," he said, "have you seen this woman?" He held up the poster. Alana's world stopped. The face staring back at her was older, cleaner, photographed in better light, but it was unmistakable. The soft cheeks, the kind eyes, the gentle curve of the mouth that smiled even when the woman couldn't remember why. Halmoni, her grandmother who wasn't her grandmother. The woman she had pulled from a cage 3 weeks ago and carried home like a wounded bird. The woman who was right now sitting in Alana's apartment, drinking jasmine tea and watching reruns because she didn't know who she was or where she belonged. The man was still talking, his voice growing more desperate with each word. Her name is Mei Lin Day. She's 67 years old. She disappeared 3 weeks ago. I'll pay anything. Anything. Please, if you know, that old woman lives in my house. The words left Alana's mouth before she could stop them. The man froze. The entire diner froze. Then his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was hope there, raw and terrible. There was fear. There was something that looked almost like prayer. "What did you say?" Alana met his gaze without flinching. She had spent her whole life being invisible, being overlooked, being the girl the city forgot. But right now, in this moment, she was the most important person in this man's universe. "I said she lives with me. Your mother. I found her 3 weeks ago, locked in a cage in an abandoned warehouse. I took her home. She's safe." The man's face crumbled. The mask he wore, the armor of power and violence and control, it shattered right there in that grimy diner, in front of strangers who would never forget this moment. His legs gave out. He caught himself on the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his shoulders shaking, and Alana realized with sudden clarity that she had just changed the course of 2 lives forever, maybe 3. Kongdae moved faster than thought. One moment he was gripping the counter, drowning in the first hope he had felt in 21 days. The next, his hands were on the girl's shoulders, fingers pressing hard enough to bruise, his face inches from hers. "Where?" The word tore from his throat. "Where is she? Take me to her. Now, right now." The girl didn't flinch. That registered somewhere in the chaos of his mind, this small, tired-looking woman in her worn jacket and her 2 big boots, staring into the face of a man who had killed with these same hands, and she didn't look away, didn't tremble, didn't cry. She simply said, "Let go of me first." Behind him, his men shifted. He could feel their confusion, their uncertainty. They had never seen their boss like this. Kongdae didn't grab strangers in public places. Kongdae didn't let his voice break. Kongdae didn't show weakness to anyone, ever. But Kongdae had also never lost his mother. He released her shoulders, stepped back, forced his breathing to slow. His hands were still shaking. He couldn't make them stop. "Please," the word came out strangled. "Please, I need to see her. I need to know she's alive. I've been searching for 3 weeks, 21 days. I thought she was dead. I thought someone took her to hurt me, and they'd already—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The girl studied him for a long moment. He felt exposed, naked, all his power and reputation stripped away until he was just a son, terrified of losing the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally. "She's alive," the girl said quietly. "She's been safe with me. She couldn't remember her name or where she came from. I've been taking care of her." Kongdae made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Come with me," the girl said. "I'll take you to her, but I need you to understand something first. Anything. She's fragile. She's been through something terrible. Whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you want to do when you see her, you need to be gentle. She doesn't need your fear. She needs your calm." Kongde stared at this stranger who spoke to him like she had every right to give him instructions, who had somehow found his mother, saved his mother, cared for his mother when his entire empire had failed. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nobody," she said, "just someone," who heard her crying. She turned and walked out of the diner. Kongde followed like a man being led to salvation. The ride across the city was silent. His men drove, tense and alert, while he sat in the back seat across from the girl Alana she'd finally said her name was, and tried to hold himself together. She gave directions calmly, her voice never wavering, her eyes watching the streets pass with the wariness of someone who had learned to always know her escape routes. She was a survivor. He recognized the look. He'd seen it in the mirror enough times. When they arrived at her building, a crumbling walk-up above a noodle shop, so far from his world of penthouse apartments and secured compounds, Kongde felt his throat tighten. His mother had been here, in this tiny place. While he searched towers and warehouses and the homes of powerful men, his mother had been drinking tea in a fourth-floor studio with a stranger who had shown her more kindness than his entire network. Alana unlocked the door, and Kongde stepped into the room where his mother sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights. She turned at the sound. For a moment, her eyes were empty, confused, looking at a stranger. Then, something shifted. She touched the scar above his eyebrow, the one he'd gotten at 14 when he'd thrown himself in front of a knife meant for her. "My little bear," she whispered. Kongde fell to his knees. The most feared man in the city wept like a child in his mother's arms, while Alana quietly stepped back and let them have this moment. And somewhere in the wreckage of his pride, Kongde understood that he owed this woman a debt that money could never repay. The apartment smelled like safety. Kongde noticed it the moment he stepped inside. Jasmine tea, toasted bread, something floral and soft that reminded him of childhood, of a time before blood and power and the weight of an empire. Alana had created a sanctuary in this cramped space. Folded napkins on the tiny table. Clean dishes drying by the sink. A worn but carefully arranged blanket on the couch where she must have been sleeping while his mother took the bed. His mother. She sat in a chair by the window, smaller than he remembered, fragile in a way that made his chest ache. The woman who had raised him alone, who had worked double shifts so he could eat, who had never once asked where the money came from when he started bringing it home. She looked lost, adrift, like a ship that had slipped its anchor. "Mother," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "It's me. It's Day." She blinked at him. Her eyes searched his face, flickering with something that wasn't quite recognition. He felt his heart crack along familiar fault lines. Then her hand rose, trembling, and touched the scar above his eyebrow. "Little bear," she whispered, "you got so big." The nickname shattered him. She used to call him that when he was small, when he'd curl up against her on cold nights because they couldn't afford heat, and she'd stroke his hair and tell him stories about a better life that was coming. He hadn't heard those words in decades. He'd thought she'd forgotten. "I'm here, Mother." His voice broke. "I'm here. I'm so sorry it took me so long. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner." She pulled him into her arms with surprising strength, and Kongde buried his face in her shoulder and wept. The tears came from somewhere deep, somewhere he'd sealed off years ago when he decided that softness was weakness and weakness was death. He cried for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become. For 21 days of imagining her body in a ditch somewhere, cold and alone. Behind him, he heard Alana moving quietly in the kitchen, giving them privacy, pretending not to witness the most powerful crime lord in the city sobbing like a lost child. Peace settled over him, fragile, precious. He held his mother and breathed in the scent of jasmine and let himself believe, for just a moment, that everything would be all right. Then his mother stiffened. Her hands gripped his shoulders, her breath quickening. Her eyes went wide, unfocused, looking at something he couldn't see. "The dragons," she whispered. "Red dragons. They came at night. They said they had a message for my son." Kong Dae's blood turned to ice. "Mother, what do you mean? What dragons?" "They knew your name." Her voice rose, panic threading through it. "They knew where I lived. They said you had to pay for what you did to their brother." Memory slammed into Kong Dae like a fist. The Red Dragon Syndicate, a rival organization he dismantled 3 years ago when they tried to move product through his territory. He'd killed their leader personally, burned their warehouses, salted the earth so thoroughly that he'd thought the threat was ended forever. He was wrong. They hadn't come for his territory. They hadn't come for his money. They had come for the only thing he actually valued, the only vulnerability he had ever allowed himself to keep: his mother. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a random kidnapping. This was calculated revenge, designed to break him from the inside out. The grief in Kong Dae's chest crystallized into something harder, something colder, something that had a body count. He stood slowly, his face emptying of everything soft. "Alana," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She appeared in the doorway, her expression wary. "I need you to stay with her. Just a little longer. Can you do that?" Alana looked at his mother, then at him. She nodded. Kong Dae bent and kissed his mother's forehead gently. Then he walked out of that sanctuary and back into a war that had never really ended. The night air hit Kong Dae like a blade. He stood on the narrow street outside Alana's building, his men forming a silent perimeter around him. They could feel the shift, could see it in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands that had finally stopped shaking. Their boss was back. The grief was gone. Something worse had taken its place. "Young," Kong Dae said quietly. His second-in-command stepped forward. "Sir, the Red Dragons. I want everything. Every survivor we missed, every safe house we didn't burn, every family member with even a whisper of connection to their operations. I want names, addresses, and eyes on all of them within the hour." "Sir," Young hesitated. "We dismantled them 3 years ago. There's nothing left." "There's always something left." Kong Dae's voice was soft, calm, terrifying. "Someone planned this. Someone executed it. Someone kept my mother in a cage for 3 weeks while I tore this city apart looking for her. That someone has a name, and by morning I will know it." Yong nodded and began making calls. Kong Dae turned to look up at the window where his mother sat. He could see Alana's silhouette moving inside, bringing tea, sitting down across from the old woman. Two strangers finding comfort in each other's company. His mother remembered now. The memories had come flooding back in broken pieces: the men in masks, the red dragon tattoos, the cold basement where they'd kept her before moving her to the warehouse. They'd asked her questions about his operations, his security, his weaknesses. She'd told them nothing, because she knew nothing, and he had always protected her from that side of his life. But they'd kept her anyway, as a message, as a wound that would never fully heal. Kong Dae understood their calculation. Kill a man's soldier, and he replaces the soldier. Kill his enemy, and the feud ends. But break his heart? Shatter the one thing he loves purely and completely? That was how you destroyed a man from the inside out. They had tried to break him. They had failed. But they had hurt his mother. They had put her in a cage like an animal. They had left her to rot in darkness, while her mind fractured from fear and neglect. For that, there would be no mercy. Kong Dae climbed into his car and began the journey back to his compound. On the way, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his weapons supplier. The second was to a man who specialized in extracting information from people who didn't want to give it. The third was to every underboss in his organization, summoning them to a meeting at midnight. By the time he arrived home, the grief had completed its transformation. He had been sad for 21 days. He had been terrified for 21 days. Now, he was something simpler, something purer. He was fury given form. The city had seen Kongde at his peak. It had witnessed his violence, his ruthlessness, his willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain his power. But it had never seen what he became when someone hurt his family. The Red Dragons had thought they could wound him and fade away. They were about to learn that some wounds don't heal. They become weapons. The fortress was silent. Kongde's compound occupied an entire block in the old industrial district, a converted factory complex with walls thick enough to stop bullets and surveillance systems sophisticated enough to track a fly. 30 of his most trusted men stood in the main hall, arranged in perfect rows, their faces masks of professional calm. But underneath that calm, Kongde could feel their fear. They knew why they'd been summoned. News of his mother's rescue had spread through his organization like wildfire. So had news of how she'd been taken. And now their boss stood before them, still as stone, his eyes moving slowly across each face. "My mother told me something interesting," Kongde said quietly. The room seemed to lean in to hear him. "She told me that the men who took her knew things, specific things. My patrol schedules, my security rotations, the back entrance to her apartment building that only my people use." He let the silence stretch. "Someone in this room," he continued, told them. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Kongde began to walk, slowly, deliberately, and past each man, close enough to see the sweat on their foreheads, the pulse in their throats. He wasn't looking for a confession. Confessions could be faked. He was looking for something subtler, a flicker of guilt, a momentary avoidance, the micro-expressions that betrayed a traitor's heart. "I have loved each of you like brothers," he said as he walked. "I have protected your families, educated your children, buried your dead with honor, and in return, I asked only one thing: loyalty." He stopped. He was standing in front of Minho. Minho, who he'd pulled from the streets 15 years ago. Minho, who he'd trained personally. Minho, who had sat at his table for holidays and called his mother auntie and sworn blood oaths of eternal faithfulness. Minho, whose left hand kept drifting toward his watch. "Show me your wrist," Kongde said softly. Minho's face went pale. "Sir, your wrist, now." The room was frozen. Kongde's men watched with the fixed attention of predators scenting blood. Minho's eyes darted left, right, calculating exits that didn't exist. Kongde grabbed his arm and ripped back the sleeve. There, hidden under an expensive watch, was a tattoo. A red dragon, coiled and ready to strike. The silence shattered. Kongde's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "How long?" Minho was shaking now, all pretense abandoned. 2 years. They approached me after the dockside deal. They offered so much money, and they said you'd never find out, and I never thought they'd actually hurt. You never thought they'd hurt my mother. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what they were planning. Kongde studied the face of the man he'd trusted, the man he'd loved like a younger brother, the man who had sold his mother's safety for money. "You knew enough," he said. He drew his knife. Minho screamed, begged, invoked every shared memory, every moment of brotherhood, every reason Kongde should show mercy. Kongde thought about his mother in a cage. He thought about her confusion, her fear, her broken mind. He thought about the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for him, who had deserved a peaceful old age instead of nightmares. The knife moved. When it was done, Kongde stood over the body of his former brother and felt nothing. The betrayal had cauterized something inside him. He had loved Minho, he had trusted Minho, and Minho had handed his mother to monsters. There was no room for grief, only justice. "Clean this up," he said to his men, "and find the others. There are always others." He walked out of the hall, leaving bloodstains on the floor. The hunt was not over, but the message had been sent. While violence prepared itself in Kongdae's fortress, a different kind of battle was being fought 4 floors above a noodle shop. Alana sat with the old woman with Mei Lin, watching the city lights blur through rain-streaked windows. The tea had gone cold hours ago, but neither of them moved to reheat it. Sometimes, silence was more comforting than words. "He's going to hurt people, isn't he?" Mei Lin asked, softly. Alana considered lying. It would be kinder, perhaps, easier. "Yes," she said instead. "He is." Mei Lin nodded slowly, her eyes still on the window. He was such a gentle boy, always bringing home injured birds, crying when he couldn't save them. She paused. The world made him hard. The world makes everyone hard. Not you. Mei Lin turned to look at her. "You found me in that terrible place, and you brought me home. You didn't know who I was. You didn't want anything. You just helped." Alana shifted uncomfortably. Kindness as a concept had always embarrassed her. She had learned early that expectations of goodness led to disappointment. "I did what anyone would do." "No." Mei Lin reached out and took her hand. "You did what almost no one does. You looked at a broken old woman and saw a person worth saving." The words settled into Alana's chest like stones dropped into still water. She had spent so long being invisible, being forgettable, being the girl the city forgot. She had never expected to matter to anyone. "Your son will come back," Alana said quietly. "He's going to want to take you somewhere safe. You should go with him. What about you?" "I'll be fine. I'm always fine." Mei Lin's grip tightened. "Come with us. I don't belong in his world. Perhaps his world needs you." Before Alana could respond, the door opened. Kongdae stepped inside, and for a moment, Alana didn't recognize him. The desperate man from the diner was gone. The weeping son from hours ago had vanished. In their place stood something carved from ice and shadow, a predator wearing human skin. But when his eyes found his mother, something flickered. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the boy who used to rescue birds. "Mother," he said softly, "it's time to go. I have a place prepared for you. Safe, comfortable. You'll have everything you need." End quote. Mei Lin rose slowly, still holding Alana's hand. "And her?" Kongdae turned to look at Alana. His gaze was assessing, curious, seeing her perhaps for the first time as more than just the stranger who had saved his mother. "Miss Kim," he said formally, "you have given me a gift I can never repay. You saved the most precious thing in my life. Name your price." "Me." Alana stared at him. "I don't have a price. Everyone has a price." "Not for this." She pulled her hand gently from Mei Lin's grip. "I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because it was right." Kongdae's expression shifted confusion, then something that might have been respect. He was a man who understood transactions, debts, leverage. Pure altruism was foreign territory. "Then let me offer something else," he said. "Protection. From this moment forward, you are under my shield. No one in this city will harm you. No one will threaten you. If you ever need anything, money, shelter, a problem solved, you come to me." Alana wanted to refuse. She had spent her whole life refusing help, building her independence, one brick at a time. But something about the way he said it, not as an obligation or a transaction, but as genuine gratitude, made her pause. "Okay," she said quietly, "but I don't want your money, and I don't want to be part of your world." Kongdae nodded slowly. "Then you'll have protection without chains, gratitude without expectations." He bowed slightly, a gesture so unexpected that Alana froze. "Thank you, Alana Kim, for everything." He turned and helped his mother toward the door. At the threshold, Mei Lin looked back. "Visit me," she said. "Please." Alana found herself nodding before she could think. Then they were gone, and she was alone again in her small apartment, surrounded by the lingering scent of jasmine tea. She sat down by the window and watched the rain fall. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely invisible. Dawn broke over the Han River like a wound healing. Kongdae stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the light spread across the water, painting the city in shades of gold and gray. Behind him, his mother slept peacefully in a bedroom designed for her comfort. Soft sheets, temperature-controlled air, medical staff on call, and security so tight that God himself would need an appointment. The war was over. In the 12 hours since he'd left Alana's apartment, his men had dismantled what remained of the Red Dragon Syndicate with surgical precision. The leaders who had ordered his mother's kidnapping were dead. The soldiers who had executed it were dead. The networks that had hidden them, the safe houses that had sheltered them, the bank accounts that had funded them, all of it was ash and memory. Minho's betrayal had led them to 3 more traitors in his organization. They were dealt with accordingly. The purge was complete, the rot excised, the lesson learned by everyone who remained. There were lines you did not cross, people you did not touch. His mother was one of them. Kongdae looked down at the stack of reward posters in his hand. 21 days of these. 21 days of taping them to walls and holding them up in diners and begging strangers for information, while his empire watched and wondered if their king had finally broken. He had broken, but broken things, he had learned, could be reforged stronger. He thought about Alana Kim. A nobody, she had called herself, just someone who heard crying. But in that simple act, hearing, responding, helping, she had done what his entire network had failed to do. She had found his mother. She had cared for her. She had brought her back from the edge of erasure. Power, Kongdae realized, was not what he had always believed it was. Power was not money. He had spent fortunes searching for his mother, and it had bought him nothing but silence. Power was not violence. He had the capacity to end anyone who stood against him, and it hadn't brought his mother home. Power was not reputation. The city feared him, and that fear had kept witnesses from coming forward, had made people look away rather than risk involvement. True power was something simpler, something he had nearly forgotten. True power was kindness. A girl with nothing had looked into darkness and chosen to help. She hadn't calculated the risks or weighed the benefits or considered what she might gain. She had simply acted from a place of basic human decency, the kind of decency that Kongdae had long ago decided he couldn't afford. And that decency had saved everything that mattered to him. He tore the posters slowly, methodically, into small pieces. The wind caught them as they fell, carrying them out over the city like confetti, like snow, like the last remnants of a nightmare finally ending. The search was over. His mother was safe. His enemies were dust. But Kongdae knew that something had shifted inside him, something that couldn't be undone. He had knelt in a grimy diner and begged a stranger for help. He had wept in his mother's arms while a woman he didn't know witnessed his collapse. He had stood in a cramped apartment and felt, for the first time in decades, something other than the cold machinery of power. He had felt gratitude, connection, the fragile, terrifying possibility of being known. The empire remained, but it was no longer hollow. Kongdae turned from the balcony and walked back inside, where the morning light was beginning to touch his mother's door. He wouldn't wake her. He would just sit in the chair beside her bed, the way she used to sit beside his when he was small and scared, and the world was too big and too cruel. He would keep watch, not as a king, not as a monster, not as the man the city feared, just as a son, and for now, that was enough.